All right, what the heck is dynamic combat? Why are you even here? Why am I here? If you find that your combats are sometimes falling flat, feels like they're dragging their feet, you're in the right place. If one side of your combat is dying completely, like all of the adversaries or your characters, you're in the right place. Heck, if every single combat you run goes perfectly, without a hitch, the way you always plan it, you're in the right place. Whatever your situation is, I'm gonna clean these. Like somebody sneezed on me. Whatever your situation is, you're in the right place, for sure. In this video, we're gonna talk about what makes a combat dynamic, how to create a sense of urgency in your combats with your players and with your narratives, how to keep that momentum going in combat from the very beginning to the very end, and how to hold your players captive. This is the second of videos in my What the Heck series, and there are plenty more to come. So if you're enjoying the content, make sure to like and subscribe to make sure that you stay up to date. Now let's get rolling. Such a flashy intro. Love it. What exactly makes combat more dynamic? Well, there are actually quite a few things that we're going to tackle in this video. And just like our combats, we're going to try and move through this thing seamlessly, quickly, and without too many distractions. To start this conversation, I want to discuss with you one of the most talked about subjects in the tabletop role-playing game community, and that's intelligent enemies. Intelligent enemies. Using those big old noodles they got to get themselves in and out of dangerous situations. They bait, they trap, but most importantly, they still attack. But they can do a lot with those things. Just like the players, they have abilities, they have spells, they have weapons, and they know how to use them. All of the options that your players have, the enemies have too. Enemies know how to flank, they know how to shove, they know how to grapple. They know how to use cover to raise their AC. They know how to use the high ground, they can concentrate, they can use spells. They're smart enough to protect their healers, and they're smart enough to protect themselves. It's just very likely that the enemies know how to do more than stand in front of the players and whack them with iron spears. It really does boil down to an idea that's that simple. It really is important that you understand how the enemies are going to act in combat well before you actually do the encounter, because if you know what their battle tactics look like, you can focus a little bit more on what their next move is and how they're getting advantage on the players instead of having to think of those things on the fly. What's their MO, what's their objective, and how are they going to accomplish that? Considering all of these things, it's also a great way to show your players what options they have. Instead of telling your rogue outright that they should be using high ground, using stealth, and getting out of combat with disengage as often as they can, let the enemies do it. Because when they see that happen, it's going to spark their imagination, and it's going to go over a lot better than telling them straight to their face that they're not using their character efficiently, which basically translates into you're not playing right. In addition to using their big old brains to get an advantage on your players, the enemies are also not very likely going to fight to the death every single combat. They're going to have a way out, and they're going to get out of there before they lose their lives. On top of that, they probably don't even want to get cut with the sword. Heck, I know I don't.
Let's get out of here.
In addition to that, something that a lot of GMs overlook is magic items and potions. Enemies have access to those just like your players. If there's a magical sword in a chest in the dungeon that they are fighting whatever creatures in, it's very likely they're going to use it, especially if they're like, gang boss has access to it. Don't just leave those things lying around. Give your players a real challenge. All right, before we get into all the rest of the super fun, juicy content that I've prepared for you with love, let's talk about mechanics. As the GM, it is important that you understand how you were approaching combat and the rule system that you have. The three most important things that you need to be able to take care of and keep track of as a DM are HP, armor class, and initiative order. Now, for me personally, I just use a piece of paper, write the names and the roles down, and then rearrange them in the order of their initiative. I tell my players when their turns are coming up, and I keep track of HP and armor class of each enemy on that same sheet of paper. Other GMs prefer to write these things down and to put pieces of paper on the back of their GM screen in the initiative order so that their players always know when their turns are coming up. It looks a little something like this. See how much easier it is to see whose turn is coming up? It also helps the players anticipate what they're going to be doing on their turn, but I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Understanding exactly how you're going to approach the system that you're running is going to help you avoid situations that sound a lot like this. Hang on, okay, 16 plus 5, and I have to take into account the temporary HP. How does that count toward the number again? Oh, and they're grappled? Maybe roll again with advantage? If you don't mind? I don't know, maybe it just means their movement is 0. Okay, hang on, wait, I gotta look this up. The less of that happens, the smoother your combat is gonna be. Let's step out of the rules and step back into the land of critical, ambiguous thought. The third thing that I want to talk to you about in this video is that you need to play against the players. It sounds mean, but really, you can offer the players a critical challenge while still cheering them on and having a lot of fun. Instead of just walking through the paces and saying that that goblin has a sword attack and that goblin has a short bow attack, you need to be considering those cute little goblins your PCs. You were actively playing them and you were attempting to do as much damage to the players as possible while taking the least amount yourself. Consider yourself a player in these situations, in every combat, and not just an almighty rules lord. If you've already mapped out battle strategies for the enemies, as mentioned in section 1 of this video, then you're not going to have to break your brain vault in concentration trying to figure out exactly how they're going to react to certain situations. This is actually a very simple setup. Let me give you an example. Let's say the aforementioned goblins are trying to ambush the players with monsters waiting around an area they need to bait them into. Are they doing damage from afar while they back up, baiting the players in, or are they coaxing the players on by attacking the spellcaster? Because believe you me, creatures that exist in a world with magic know what a glass cannon is. You're just playing against your players' strategies instead of bopping them with the single attack goblins have until somebody falls to 0. Now that we got some big brain bad boy monsters, wish I had another B word that could go into that. Big brain bad boy baddies. Worse. That was worse. And we have a GM with the mindset of a player. Let's talk about how every combat doesn't have to end in violence. We're going to talk about writing hooks into your combat scenarios. If every combat you run ends up with one of the opposing sides dying, you've got what I like to refer to as a static combat. Combat has so much potential to be more, to be narrative, to be able to sink your teeth into it. And the monsters or enemies that your players are fighting probably have motives and personalities. What are their ideals? Why are they fighting? If it's a group of thugs, what led them to this lifestyle? If it's Durgar dug up onto the surface, how far are they really willing to fight because they heard that surface people are bad? At what point will the enemies start talking during combat? More than that, at what point will they start convincing the players that they have to be here, that they don't want to die, that there's another way out of this? What are their true motives? Who are they and how loyal are they to those things? I want to encourage you to write these hooks into combat into whatever's appropriate for the world that you're playing in. But here are just a few examples of some that I like to use. Hostage situations. The PCs only have a certain amount of time before the enemies kill another NPC that they care about or have never met before. Enemies and monsters begging for their lives. They don't want to die in this situation and they'll do anything if the players will let them go. Trying to convince the players that they are the ones who are in the wrong and that they've been tricked into having to fight these people. Now, these are pretty simple ideas that you can put into your combat as hooks, but they're really going to spice it up. And there are way bigger ideas that you could really hook into these combats for your players that are going to lead them to other parts of the world. Maybe this is where you introduce an NPC that's going to be very important to them. Maybe this is where you introduce an item that they really need and that the enemy is using. These things are going to teach your players that violence isn't always the answer. It's going to stop them from being murder hobos. And in addition to that, it is going to condition them so that maybe, just just maybe, violence isn't the answer that your players always choose. All right, so you're pretty set to run a super smooth combat that is going to feel much more alive than a static combat with characters who just hit the players. They have motives, they have personalities. They're a little bit smarter than your average bear, unless of course your players are fighting bears. And you as the GM have a little bit more of a commitment to exactly the strategies and advantages that the enemies are going to use. So let's talk about where this is happening. Using cool environments can change everything. And I don't just mean get out of the dungeon every once in a while. I'm also talking about using water, cliffs, trees, and letting enemies use those things as well. Creating high grounds, creating cover, creating places where the players and the enemies alike can hide. In addition to the literal setting, add some environments that feel a little more alive. Is there a swinging bridge? Is there lava underneath it? These are some pretty basic concepts, but consider for a moment that the enemies have been here before, that they have set traps and they know where they are, but the players don't. Maybe they've rigged rocks to fall on top of the players as a rock slide. Maybe they've rigged a dam to bust in an attempt to wash the players away. Aside from bamboozling the living dog poop out of your players, consider things like the weather, architecture. All I want you to do is start introducing things that are a little more interesting than a flat battle map. Now, I'm sure throughout this video you've been saying, I know he's going to use that map and terrain in front of him. Well, you're absolutely right. Here we go. As you can see, I have a little bit of a combat scenario set up here. And while it looks like fun because I have these sweet styrofoam rock pieces, it's still just a flat battle map. There's not a lot to go off of except for counting the literal spaces of distance between each character and each enemy. Let's add a little bit of cover to the map. And just like that, we have a more interesting map. Now, don't be intimidated by my setup here. You don't have to have highfalutin bougie pieces to put on the map. You can easily do this with cut out pieces of paper or circles that you just draw on your map and put 10 feet on so that your players know that there's some cover they can get behind, rubble or whatever it is. Now, in addition to the cover and the interesting things that we put on the map, let's try adding a little high ground. Would you look at that? Our ranger is using the high ground to ensure that they have advantage and can see the field a lot better. Our spellcaster is in the back with a little better line of sight to the enemies and more protection for themselves. This has given both your players and the monsters that you're fighting against bountiful opportunities to spice up combat of their own accord. I'm just encouraging you to use your imagination and to get creative. Think about things like the weather around them. Are there other NPCs that might hear this battle? How will they react? Or is there any architecture above them, around them? All I'm saying is that a cape flapping high atop a windy cliff is always going to be in style. House rules, variant rules, and balance. If it feels cheap or forced, it probably is. Now, before we get into this, I want you to be wary of babying your players. Don't just introduce rules that benefit them, and keep in mind that there are large teams of developers who have play tested the crap out of these games. So these rules have seriously been put through the ringer, but that doesn't mean that they're always right, and it doesn't mean they always feel right. A couple of rules that I use in my Dungeons & Dragons campaign look like this. More often than not, I've seen my players get a critical hit, and what that does is let them roll damage twice, and I have seen it happen way too many times where they roll as low as possible 2 times. So what I've done is I let my players roll their damage once, and they add it to the maximum amount of damage they could possibly do. That way you ensure that they lay the smackdown on their enemies. In addition to that, I use the variant rule critical injuries. Critical injuries states that when a character falls to 0, they don't just get a little bit of CPR and feel so much better. Something serious is going to happen to them, because falling to 0 likely means that something serious has happened to them. You roll on a table and sometimes you come out okay, just got the wind knocked out of you, someone gave you the people's elbow right to the face and you couldn't handle it. Other times you lose an eye, which is going to make it harder to make perception checks, or you lose a foot, which is going to half your speed. Things like this will make players think on their feet and keep them more engaged in the combat. All right, let's talk about something that I don't see in any of these, I don't even know what to call them, self-help seminars for game masters. Sorry you're here. But seriously, I want to talk about something I don't see in any of the other content that's talking about how to improve your combat. And that is Player agency. Your players have as much influence in combat as you do, so you need to give them some of the responsibility of it. The first thing that we need to talk about with player agency is your players knowing when it's their turn, paying attention when it's not their turn, and being ready when their turn comes up. If you haven't had this conversation yet with your players, it's time to lay down the law. Your players gotta know when it's their turn and what they're gonna be doing on their turn. I give my players a limited amount of time to make their decisions. That way, there's a little bit more pressure on them to be cheering each other on and to be paying attention. But also, it doesn't end up in your players taking 10 minutes to decide what they want to do, because nothing is worse for combat than turns being drug out and everybody becoming disengaged from boredom. Now, of course, there are exceptions to every rule. Sometimes the enemy that they were after die. Sometimes they'll get the high ground or cast invisibility or explode into a million pieces of candy. I don't know what kind of campaign you're running. Have a little bit of grace for the players. Something that's super duper fun is letting your players narrate combat themselves. You're already the god king of everything, so why don't you take a step back and let somebody else sit in the spotlight for just a second. Now, this doesn't mean that the players get to delegate exactly what's happening in combat, but they can narrate what they're attempting to do. This is going to allow them to feel like they have some weight to throw around in the fight, and it's going to keep them engaged and excited to describe what they're doing and where combat's going. In addition to describing their attempts, something that my players love is I let them flavor their kills. So instead of me telling them that the unicorn's horn falls from its head and turns to dust as their sword plunges through its heart, they might want to talk about cutting all of its legs off and then slamming its head into a tree. And while that's brutal, they're going to have a whole lot more fun with it. And honestly, who cares how it dies? It's dead anyway. Let them have a little bit of fun with it. And while you're at it, ask them to stop killing unicorns. They're not even bad guys. Now, this one is going to take a little bit more patience, a little bit more taste, a little bit more preparation. But I believe in you, and I know that you can do it. It's a short one, but if you're not doing it, you gotta. It's going to change your combat. It's going to make the whole room feel different because you're going to set a different atmosphere. Atmosphere is not too hard to create or to maintain, but it is going to take a little bit more prep on your part. You can use a laptop, you can use a phone, you can use the lighting in your house. The way that you're going to create a really cool atmosphere is with music, sound effects, and lighting, just like this. Okay, not just like that. But let's consider music for a second. What are you playing during combat? Is there something that's going to get the player's hair to stand up on their arms? Is there something that's going to make the situation feel dreadful and unwinnable? Is it something that gets the players pumped up and inspired and ready to knock some teeth out of monster heads? Sound effects are as easy to come by as the music. There are tons of free soundboards that you can use online. And speaking of music and sound effects, in the description of the video below, I'm going to include just a few resources for you to use, some that I use at my table and that I thoroughly enjoy. On top of all of the sounds that are filling the room as combat happens, you also need to be thinking about lighting. A little bit of lighting can go a long way. I've just collected the candles that were in my bedroom and the bathroom, and we have a completely different vibe going on. Maybe we are deep inside of a dungeon with just a little bit of light. Maybe we're involved in a cult ritual, or maybe it just feels cool as heck and we like it a lot. Either way, it feels spooky as heck and I'm creeping myself out. You get the point. Let's go back to where we were before. Lighting can completely change the mood of a room, the atmosphere of it, and what a combat feels like. In addition to that, a change of pace is always nice. All right, I've saved the best and my most favorite for last, and it's something that too many GMs overlook. You need to be narrating combat. The first and most important step in a good combat narrative is to stop considering HP as meat points. HP, like anything else in whatever system you're playing, is just a narrative tool. If death is 0 or near 0, what does it look like to become 10% closer to that? It's unlikely that becoming 10% closer to death means your arm is cleaved all the way from your shoulder down to your fingers and blood is pouring onto the ground. More likely than that, your shield gets a dent in it, or your armor gets dented, or you get the wind knocked out of you and you throw up on the ground a little bit. Which of these things sounds better? The Yeti jumps down from the cliffside in the snow and you see its eyes. Roll a con save. I roll a 10. You fail and are paralyzed and take 8 cold damage. The Yeti then swings at you with advantage, and with a 23 hits you. You're gonna take 32 damage. Or the guttural simian howls descend and are followed by an even louder thud as a white ape-like creature jumps from the ledge just over all of your heads. Confidence and animosity pour off of it. It is unflinching and it looks right into your eyes. As you make eye contact, something unexpected happens. The blue glow of its gaze seems to pierce through the blur of snow around you, and its cold glare cuts into your soul. Roll a Constitution saving throw. I roll a 10. You try to move, to get out of the way, but you can't. You can't break away from this thing's stare. You're paralyzed. Somehow it has frozen you in place. You take 8 cold damage. Once it realizes you aren't moving, it is upon you. Since you were paralyzed, it will roll with advantage. With the 23, you feel the full force of its brute strength in the winter that courses through this creature as its claws crumple your body for a total of 32 damage. Even in the blinding maelstrom of ice, the blood splattered across the snow and this beast's white fur is clearly visible. Way more fun, right? And it feels more like a description and like you're telling a story than just walking through the paces of a combat that's taking too long. Being hit and missing loses its luster quickly, but do not fall into the trap of thinking you have to narrate every single thing. Sometimes a hit is just a hit, and that's fine. If it's low, just move on to the next one. Don't feel like you have to turn everything into a heroic epic. And while we're talking about things you're not going to worry about, don't worry about taking a few liberties. Take into consideration the narrative tools that the enemy has as well. For instance, if a spider is biting your players, it's unlikely that they miss completely or just hit a shield because your player is going to roll a con save to see if they are poisoned. It's as simple as factoring this into what happens. Maybe a fang just grazes their arm. Maybe in the deflection as the shield hits the spider's head, some of the venom touches their skin, burning through it. Don't overcomplicate it. Just make sure that you're having fun. That's all these videos exist for. I just want to make sure that your campaigns, your encounters, your stories, and your players are as much fun and that you're having as much fun as possible. Thanks for joining me in my second ever What the heck video. I plan on making a lot more of these, so if you're enjoying the content, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It's a super cool, super free way to support me. As always, I just want to say there's no right way to play any of these games. I only make these guides because I want to enhance your experience so that its power levels are over 9,000. And if you think I missed anything, or if you heard something in this video that is going to change the way that you approach combat, please let me know in the comment section below. Thanks again for joining. Thank you for your support, and I'll catch you next time on What the Heck?